The wind carried dust across the open plains as the sun hung low over the horizon, bleeding orange light across the sky. Miles Bennett rode his dark stallion through the dry fields of the west, his boots and gloves clean enough to show he wasn't the kind of man who worked the dirt anymore. He owned half the land in 3 counties and loaned money to those who barely had enough to keep their barns standing. That morning, he had ridden out to collect one such debt, owed by a man named Thomas Hale. The rancher's ledger said the debt was nearly 2 years overdue, and Miles didn't like being ignored. He rode past fences falling apart, fields gone yellow, and a small wooden house that looked like it had been built with hope instead of lumber. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney. As he dismounted, his boots struck the dust with a heavy thud. He tied his horse to a broken fence post and climbed the steps, noticing the quiet. No barking dog, no sound of boots, no voice to greet him, just the faint cry of a baby coming from inside. He knocked once. The door opened slowly, and a woman stood there. She was young, far too young to have the weary look she carried in her eyes. Her hair was tied back, though a few strands clung to her damp face. In one arm she held an infant, and behind her in the dim light of the small room, 4 other children clung to her dress. Their faces were thin, their eyes wide. Miles paused, unsure if he had the right house. He asked for Thomas Hale, expecting a gruff farmer or a man who'd come out with excuses. Instead, the woman's eyes dropped to the floor, and she said that Thomas was gone. The fever took him last winter. Miles felt the air shift between them. The words hit harder than he expected. The ledger in his hand suddenly seemed smaller, insignificant against the sight before him. He looked past her into the room. There was hardly anything there. A table with uneven legs, a pot on the stove barely steaming, and 5 pairs of little boots lined against the wall. The woman adjusted the baby in her arms, and he could see the tremor in her fingers. She said she'd been trying to make ends meet by sewing for neighbors and taking in laundry, but times were hard. The crops had failed, and even the neighbors who used to help now had little to spare. Miles said he had come to collect what Thomas owed, but the words came out quieter than he meant. The woman's head lifted then, her eyes not pleading, not angry, just tired. She said she knew about the debt and had hoped to find a way to pay something soon, but there was nothing left now. The cattle had been sold, the tools pawned, the land barely producing anything worth taking. She said if he needed to take the house, then he should, but asked him to let her keep the small patch out back for a garden, so her children could eat. The wind blew through the doorway, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Miles looked at the baby, then at the others behind her. 2 boys, 2 girls, the oldest maybe 10. They stared at him like he was the lawman come to take what little peace they had left. He cleared his throat and stepped inside. The floor creaked under his boots. He walked to the table and placed the ledger down, looking around. The roof leaked in one corner. A thin blanket hung as a curtain. A cracked plate sat on the table beside a small loaf of bread. He had seen poor before, but not like this. Not this hollow kind that ate through the soul. He asked her name. She said her name was Clara Hale. She had married Thomas when she was 17, and together they'd built the small home with borrowed lumber and bigger dreams. Thomas had taken the loan to buy seed and tools, believing a good harvest would set them right. But the rains didn't come, and the sickness did. Now she stood alone in the house they built, carrying everything that was left of him. Miles felt something stir in his chest, something unfamiliar. He had built his fortune on numbers, not feelings. But as he looked at her hands, raw from work, shaking slightly as she soothed the baby, he felt the weight of his own wealth pressing against him like a curse. He told her he would give her time, that the debt didn't need to be settled right away. She thanked him with a quiet nod, her eyes still wary, as though kindness was another bill that would come due later. He left the house and rode back to his ranch, but he couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. That night, as he sat at his grand dining table, the fire glowing behind him and a plate of roast beef untouched before him, he thought of the thin soup she'd been stirring, of the way the children had watched him without speaking. He tried to read through his papers, to think of the next cattle deal or the railroad contract waiting for his signature, but his mind kept drifting back to that small, worn house on the edge of his land. The next morning, Before sunrise, he saddled his horse again. He loaded a few sacks, flour, beans, coffee, a slab of bacon, and tied them behind his saddle. His foreman, an older man named Garrett, asked where he was headed. Miles just said he had business to finish. When he reached the Hale property, the sun was just breaking over the hills. Clara was outside, hanging washed clothes on a line strung between two posts. The baby was tied to her back, and the other children were gathering sticks near the garden patch. She turned when she saw him, her face tightening for a moment as though expecting bad news. But when he untied the sacks and set them by the porch, her hands froze mid-air. He said the supplies were extra from his storehouse, things he didn't need. She said she couldn't take charity, but he told her it wasn't charity. It was payment for the quilts she'd sewn for one of his ranch hands. He lied, and she must have known, but she didn't argue. Days turned into weeks, and Miles found reasons to visit again. Sometimes he brought feed, sometimes tools that were too many for his ranch. He'd fix the fence when it broke, repair the roof before the next rain. Clara would try to thank him, always careful not to seem dependent, always standing tall despite the exhaustion that clung to her. One afternoon, he came by and found the oldest boy struggling to carry a bucket of water from the well. Miles took it from him and asked his name. The boy said it was Luke. Miles spent the next hour teaching Luke how to brace his knees and carry weight properly, how to use the strength of his legs instead of his back. The other children watched, laughing when Miles lifted 2 buckets at once and walked like a proud fool toward the porch. Even Clara smiled then, a small, reluctant curve of the lips that made his chest feel tight. He realized he hadn't heard laughter in his big, empty house in years. He'd spent so long chasing profit that he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Every time he rode away from her home, the distance between his ranch and hers felt longer, heavier. Winter came early that year. The nights turned bitter, and the land froze hard. One evening, a storm rolled in, fierce and cold. Miles couldn't sleep, thinking of that small house with its cracked windows. At dawn, he saddled up again and rode through the snow, his horse pushing against the wind. When he reached her house, the chimney was still smoking, but the front door rattled in the wind. Inside, he found Clara huddled by the fire, the children wrapped in blankets. The baby was crying, and she was trying to keep the last of the wood burning. Without a word, Miles went outside and brought in armfuls of logs from his pack. He helped her patch the fire and stayed until the storm eased. When she finally looked at him, exhaustion in her eyes, she asked why he cared. He didn't answer, but the look he gave her said more than words could. By spring, the land began to green again. Clara's garden sprouted new life, and Miles had quietly arranged for seed and tools to be delivered through the general store under her name. He'd written off the Hale debt in his ledger, crossing it out in silence one night. No one would ever know. When he rode out that spring morning and saw her standing in the sunlight, her children chasing each other in the field, he realized he'd come for a debt, but found something far greater. He found a reason to stop counting what the world owed him. He dismounted and walked toward her. She looked at him, her eyes softer than before. He told her he was thinking of hiring help at his ranch for the spring planting, said she could bring the children, that they'd have food and a roof. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. As they loaded what little she had into his wagon, Miles glanced once more at the house where he'd first knocked months ago, the place that had taught him more about worth than all his ledgers combined. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the wagon rolled toward the Bennett ranch, Clara sat beside him, holding the baby close. The children slept in the back, lulled by the motion. Miles looked ahead at the golden fields stretching wide, endless. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit or debt or gain. He was thinking about the warmth of a home filled with laughter, about a woman who had nothing left but still gave everything she had. The rich rancher had come to collect what was owed, but he left with a family he didn't know he needed, and a heart that finally remembered how to feel.